Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. This year marks 80 years since World War II broke out and left behind massive devastation all around the world. The war was a turning point in history. It ushered in a new form of diplomacy, but also a new form of warfare. This 80-year anniversary serves as a time to reflect upon how much the world has changed since 1945. But it also serves as an opportunity to critically analyze what trajectory we are on and what the global security architecture has evolved to become. Joining us for this discussion today is Mr. Einar Tangen, analyst, joining us from Beijing. We're also joined by Dr. Sascha Auerbach, who's a lecturer of history at the University of Nottingham, joining us from London. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Tangen, now let me begin with you. World War II was a war that caused deaths amongst 80 million people. It caused massive devastation. Economies were on the brink of collapse. After that, what do you think were lessons learned on a global scale?
Well, there was a lot of lessons learned from World War I, and there's this idea that you couldn't force repatriations. Large reparation fees on these countries, as it would just lead to more wars in the future. So the U.S. and to some extent its allies put together the Bretton Woods idea, and this led to the Marshall Plan, this idea that they would rebuild the economies that they had, in essence, destroyed. Mm-hmm. It did come at some cost because it kind of ignored the allies. Great Britain and France did not get as much aid as Japan and Germany did. And part of it was altruistic, this idea that you would create a more lasting world order. And part of it, I think, was a little bit cynical. There was this idea that by building up these nations that were basically under the duty and obligation to the United States, mm-hmm. that it would be a countermeasure against any other trouble that could come forward in the future. But right. From that, you get this great society, Woodrow Wilson, and the ideas of the United Nations, and that's where things started to take off.
Right. And now talking about the United Nations and how the League of Nations served as being a platform but failed in all of its imposing of mechanisms and actually trying to find a solution, and now reworking the United Nations. Let's talk about the balance of power and how that changed after World War II.
Yeah. It was very hopeful, and that's the best way to do it. You know, when you're dealing with nations, it's very difficult to get them to obey laws. It's by consensus. Each nation is sovereign. And so the idea that you could, create something that was legally binding, going towards this idea of a world government, in which case, countries would in essence become self-governing states, but they would be ruled and have a monetary policy that was fair to all, never really materialized, nor did the Esperanto, the language of the future. But these were very idealistic things. They just didn't work out in real life. So instead, the UN tried to create this kind of peer pressure mm-hmm. Idea, but it was complicated by, the Cold War, the outbreak of, hostilities between the three largest single powers, Russia, China, and the U.S.,
right.
made it very, very difficult to reach this kind of consensus. Mm-hmm. So the UN was largely marginalized at that time. Countries that had something in particular could bring it there, but there was absolutely not a unanimity as if one side of America was on one side, right. Russia was bound to be on the other.
Right. And Mr. Tangen, stay on. Now let's move on and talk a little about the Cold War, because we can't forward into the present day without talking about what happened in between. Dr. Auerbach, now take us through that. Now, what were the main values that changed from World War II to coming to the Cold War, and talking about how warfare changed, how diplomacy changed, and what were some of the lessons that were learned from World War II and were then again applied to Cold War?
Well, I think the explanations given previously were very accurate from a Western perspective. I take a more cynical look at things, which is we have to see the post-war period from the Soviet perspective and the Chinese perspective. We should keep in mind that the lessons that the Soviets learned from World War II were very different from the lessons that the United States learned. The United States had significant casualties, 400,000 casualties, but the Soviet Union lost 1/4 of its population in World War II. And the lesson they learned between that and what they saw, again, their perspective, not necessarily the accurate one, of a fairly aggressive stance by the Western powers following the end of hostilities in World War II, was that, yes, the war had ended, but the next war was definitely somewhere on the horizon. And
Right.
it was a circumstance changed entirely by something we haven't mentioned yet, which is the presence of nuclear weapons,
Right.
which the Soviet Union, accelerated its program immediately afterwards.
Right.
So yes, I think there was an investment in international cooperation, an investment, a desire not to see that type of incredibly destructive warfare in the future, but at least from the perspective of the Soviet Union and to a certain extent China as well, their idea was that this was not the end of great wars. This had been the worst, but it certainly wasn't going to be the last. And a lot of what has explained the ongoing tension
Right.
between the Soviet Union and now Russia and China and the United States is an unwillingness, I think, on the part of Western nations to really understand what the experience of World War II was like for those powers. And China, too. China lost 10 million people in the Second World War.
Right. And now something that throughout the show I would like to somehow address or at least try to find answers to while we progress in our discussion is, why do wars happen? That is the central question. And has that reason changed over time? Mr. Tangen, I'd like your comments on that.
Not. I mean, if you look at the rich history of humankind, about 5,000 years of recorded history, you see the same mistakes being made over again. In essence, you have empires rise, generally at the expense of others, and then at some point they crumble, and that creates a vacuum, or a contender comes through. And this results in frictions, and you have inevitably some sort of war. Part of it is due to the arrogance of the power that is on top, assuming that everything that it has created is somehow sacred and an ultimate answer. And the expanding powers who chafe against this kind of imperial attitude and
Right.
believe that they have the ability to do that. So you have that with China and the U.S. now. You had that with Great Britain and Germany during World War I.
Right. And Dr. Auerbach, going to this question of why wars happen, something that happened before World War II was the rise in nationalism, the rise in fascism. That's something that we're also witnessing today. How important of a factor do you think that has been and that continues to be when we talk about wars, whether they're proxy wars or invasion of countries? How important do you think is the concept of nationalism?
I think it's absolutely essential, and that's actually where I'm going to depart from my colleague and sort of an understanding of why wars happen, is the explanation for why wars happen changes dramatically with the rise of nationalism and also with the rise of capitalism. In the past, when wars were fought, they were generally, the decision to fight a war and the decisions made within that war were not made by the general population in any sense of the word. These were societies that were ruled by a very small number of elites that were able to harness a select number of their population, a select amount of their resources to put towards war. Nationalism, when combined with industrialization, completely changes the nature of warfare. Wars are now fought between entire populations, not just between elite and the forces they're able to marshal. Right. So we really do have, going forward, we really have to see a very, very different paradigm for why a major war might start. The other one we should factor into is democracy. And democracy, unless we go back to ancient Greece, really didn't exist in any real form prior to the 19th century. And one of the truisms of modern history is that democracies tend not to wage aggressive wars against one another because it's so hard to maintain that popular support and because the damage done to the social infrastructure of the society is so tremendous.
Right.
The other thing, again, we have to add in is if whenever we're thinking about a future war, we have got to factor in the issue of nuclear weapons.
Right.
In the history of warfare, there's never been a weapon that's only been used once. And rational world leaders are very aware of the incredible looming catastrophe that accompanies maybe even just a brush fire border war.
Right. Mr. Tangen, going back to you and following from whatever Dr. Auerbach talked here about, now let's talk about the security architecture that was put in place after World War II and that continues to exist today. How does that need to be reworked? I mean, we talked about the United Nations and we know its drawbacks. When we look at the world today, from Syria, civilian infrastructure being targeted, to Kashmir, where there is a blatant violation of human rights, it seems like on the security front, the main institution that's supposed to maintain peace is failing. What needs to be done to rework it? And do you think lessons were learned from that time? I mean, it seems like this institution is becoming as ineffective as perhaps the League of Nations was before.
Well, I think that is a fair criticism. The UN has, in essence, been sidelined, and it's been sidelined by unfortunately, by the very powers who were most interested in creating it. I mean, the United States. I mean, when you start talking about what happened in Libya, in Iraq, these are in essence the problems that we have now. I mean, you can even go back to the Balfour Declaration and what has happened and created Israel. It seems post World War II, a lot of the solutions that were supposedly going to end warfare instead just set up a new set of problems. But, building on what my colleague has said, I agree. I mean, these modern forces have changed the nature of warfare. The idea of bringing all the people to the battle, that was the levée en masse under Napoleon. He was able to excite nationalist feeling to get them there. And then, of course, industrialization made the killing even much more efficient. But today we have other weapons, not in addition to nuclear. This issue of cyber warfare and increasingly complex, interrelated world in which we live in has become the next battlefront.
Right. And on that point, I'd like to introduce another guest who's joined us, Mr. Joel Schalit, who's a journalist joining us from Berlin. Thank you so much, Mr. Schalit, for joining us and talking to us about this. Now, talking once again about the idea of nationalism and the rise in the right wing that we see and witness today. How much of a threat does that become to global security? I mean, it was a threat once before. That's what led to things like the Holocaust. That's what led to such massive killings. Now, today, when we're seeing this emerge in European nations and nations all across the world, how does that change the dynamics of peace and stability?
On the 80th anniversary of the start of the Second World War, nationalism is the biggest security problem in Europe today. I'm speaking in particular from the concerned standpoint of being an Israeli American Jewish journalist based in Berlin, who lost 2/3 of his family in Europe during World War II. The ghosts of the past are part of my present as a 52-year-old. My parents' generation were destroyed by the Nazis. And the Italian fascists. My family is partially of Italian origin. And so I acutely sense the danger of renewed nationalism in my home in Germany, as well as in Italy. The major problem driving the nationalist crisis in Europe today is the neoliberal economic policies enacted by most European Union member states, as well as flawed attempts to integrate, for example, in Germany, former members of the Communist East in the capitalist West. Much of the revolt of the German Alternative for Deutschland party, for example, in Germany, is motivated by or inspired by a lack of adequate integration of Eastern Germans into the victorious Germany of the Western Bloc of the Cold War era. 25 years after their formal incorporation into Germany, many of them still feel like they're not a part of this country. And what right-wing leaders across Germany have done is they have manipulated the anxieties and the lack of a sense of home that these people feel into a tool to scapegoat against German multiculturalism and German and immigrants to Germany. One must remember that prior to the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, Germany had become a multicultural society in which diversity was a fact of life here.
Right. And on that point, Mr. Schalit, on to us, and I want to get a historical perspective on this. Dr. Auerbach, talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union and how American hegemony all across the world, increased. How were American values then exported to other nations? How were neoliberal policies then given and taken to other nations? How did that become the dominant framework throughout which most of the policies worked?
Well, I think first off, we have to separate neoliberalism from free market capitalism, because neoliberalism is a very particular form of organizing social resources and economic resources. I think that's a much more recent event. Capitalism was exported through things like the Marshall Plan, which my colleague mentioned earlier, through the American reconstruction of Germany, the American reconstruction of Japan, which was done for the most part with honorable intentions, the desire to create a lasting free democratic societies. But there were also efforts to change those economies into consumerist market-driven economies. And adding to what Mr. Schalit just said, a lot of the sense of dispossession, of exclusion, whether you're looking at East Germany or East Germans and the AfD, or the Trump movement in America, or Brexit, and what's increasingly looking like a kind of almost soft seizure of power in Britain by the hard right Tories, is a sense of economic disassociation. That the gap growing between the haves and the have-nots has widened tremendously, and all our economic measurements show this to be the case. This was not the case in the 1950s and 1960s, when you had in Germany, in Japan, in the United States, well into the 1980s, a thriving kind of empowered, politically and culturally empowered middle class. So I think to put it just on a counter-reaction to multiculturalism is you're kind of missing the forest for the trees on that one. That's part of it. That's where it's much easier for populist politicians on the right to redirect anger, because it's an obvious, visible target. The strange thing to a historian is that you're seeing a lot of these weird populist alliances that you saw before the outbreak of World War II. And Nazi Germany is a great example, where you had wealthy industrialists, landowners, what was left over of the old imperial aristocracy, seeing a populist leader, Adolf Hitler, as a great way to get people on board with a program that benefited them against workers. And that's what I think you see these days too.
Right. Mr. Tangen, talking about the inequality and how it has risen tremendously today between developing nations, developed nations. Now, I want to go and trace back the roots to that in World War II and what preceded afterwards. I mean, that was also a period of decolonization, but it was also a period of Cold War where there was the threat of communist regimes being propped up. There were ideologies at play. Now, the inequality that manifests today, how much of that has its roots to what was happening then?
Well, actually not that much. I would separate it into different periods. And one is the Cold War period, where basically things were at a standstill. There were proxy wars and things going back and forth. But after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have this embrace by the United States under this kind of American exceptionalism, this idea that was created by Francis Fukuyama, where he thought that the ultimate ideology, the way of governing man, had been discovered, and that there was no other way, and that somehow the U.S. was the guiding light that would take everybody into this new perfect future. Very, very ideologically driven. So they start off with WTO. In 2001, you basically have a world economy that is generating 50 trillion in GDP. Now you go forward to 2017, and you have 127 trillion. Now during that period, what happens is 2/3 of the profits go to the advanced countries, whether it's U.S., Europe, Japan to a certain extent, South Korea. But during that same period, the rest of the nations, their middle classes are growing astronomically. They're enjoying great growth. They actually exceed the growth of the developed or advanced countries. But ironically, during this time, and this is really where the seeds of malcontent come, and I don't necessarily agree that it's nationalism itself. I think nationalism is a tool. I would agree with my previous colleague who said that. The middle class is not doing well. Over a 30-year period in the U.S., 90% of the people experience a 0.4%
Mr. Tangen, sorry to cut you short there, but since we're running short on time for this segment, I just want to get last comments from Dr. Auerbach on something that Mr. Jewell talked about, which was that the ghosts of the past still continue to haunt him and generations coming from whatever happened. What do you see today that is strikingly similar to that period back in World War II during the Cold War that you see as being red flags for the times to come?
I would say, to me, that the most frightening thing, besides the rise of the far right, is the impatience and exhaustion with the democratic process and the willingness of populist leaders to identify their own governments and even their own legislative bodies as somehow being the enemy of the people. And you have that term used a lot. The truth about democracy is that it's slow and it's deliberate and it's complicated for a reason. And the moment a populist leader offers a simple solution to complicated problems, that's often when wars happen.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Dr. Sascha Auerbach, for joining us from London. And thank you so much, Mr. Einar Tangen, for joining us from Beijing. Thank you, Joel Schalit, for joining us from Berlin. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special while we continue our discussion. Now we're joined by Mr. Uluc Ozulker, who's a former Turkish ambassador, joining us from Bodrum. Lawrence Korb, senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and a senior advisor to the Center for Defense Information. He was also the former director of National Security Studies at Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Joining us from Lewis, Delaware, and Mr. Valerio Bordonaro, an advisor to the former Italian Prime Minister Enrico Letta, joining us from Rome, Italy. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to this show. Mr. Korb, I'd like to begin with you. Now, talking a little about the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, how that created a power vacuum in the world. And how, when a power vacuum is created, there's space for an emerging power to come about. Now, what security threats does that bring?
Well, what has happened since the end of the Cold War, you've had a great many more countries get nuclear weapons. For example, in the 90s, both India and Pakistan got them. North Korea is getting them now. It looked like the Iranians were moving in that direction. The arms control agreements with the United States and then the Soviet Union and Russia are all about to expire, so you could start a new nuclear arms race. So that's obviously one dimension that has made the world more dangerous. The other thing is that you've had a lot of countries now pursuing their own policies, not following either the United States or the Soviet Union. You've had China rising. You've had South Korea and Japan breaking apart their alliance. You've had differences in NATO between the United States and a lot of the European countries. And of course, the Middle East is very, very unstable.
And through the stability and instability paradox at play here, and how wars have become something that operate on the periphery while making sure that the center is secure.
Well, what's happened is the wars that are fought now are not between the major powers as we had in World War II or could have had during the Cold War. These are limited engagements. The problem with them is that they become nation-building exercises. As we've seen in Afghanistan, we routed the Taliban, we drove out Al-Qaeda, but we've had a difficult time in setting up a new state. Similarly, in Iraq, we got rid of Saddam Hussein, But then, of course, you had instability and ISIS came in. You've had the Arab Spring, in which a lot of people in the Middle East have risen up. We're still feeling the effects of that in Syria.
Right. Mr. Ozulker, I'm going to go to talk a little more on the diplomatic front. Now, as Mr. Korb stated, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, since the end of the Cold War, more people now have, more countries have nuclear weapons. The dynamics, the power dynamics have shifted. How has diplomacy kept up with the process? How have dynamics regarding that changed?
I think we have to consider it from, historically speaking, there has been a breakthrough after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And as such, actually, beginning in 1990s and coming up to 2010, the United States was the only power in the world. Imposing themselves with an internationalization of every problem. And they were holding the situation in hand. But Putin, as he's become more and more powerful in Russia, and has become a rival to the United States. And secondly, when Mr. Trump took up the presidency in the United States, the American policy has changed strongly. And I think that the policy that Mr. Trump is actually running is creating a chaos in the world, if you wish. From the economic side, from the commercial side, political side, whatever you take up, it's only the American interests and nothing more. And this has, of course, brought rivalry in the world in different countries. Right. China is growing, and Russia is now, not economically speaking, but politically and militarily speaking, Russia has become a major power in the world, competing actually directly with the United States. And in the world, the BRIC countries altogether, the 5 countries, are now emerging more and more. And we can almost speak of one nation supremacy, and we have to share now the responsibilities as much as the power in the world. And the world
Mr. Ozulker, stay on that point. I want to move to Mr. Bordonaro and talk to him about the dynamics at play here. Now, there are wars all across the Middle East, if we take, for instance, Yemen, Syria, and then we talk about Kashmir, the ongoing conflict right now. Do you think that the mechanisms and institutions propped up after World War II throughout the Cold War, they have failed to provide a suitable platform for multilateral dialogue and discussion?
Well, thank you, Meshal, for this question. We have a very clear answer to your question, and is that the scheme that was born after the World War II failed, totally failed, in trying to address the Middle East. Nowadays, I see something different happening. I see more the Middle East as Western Asia, and I see more and more all the resources and the political attention and will moving toward East. We are going to see in the next future that it's no longer about the Western countries or the Anglo-Saxon countries to try to address, because we proved not to be able to do it, but it's more about the economic growth of Asia that will fix these imbalances in the Middle East. It's not the scheme that we know, that we use for many other countries like Korea, Vietnam, or many places in South America, or Afghanistan in the 80s. It's no longer the case to use that scheme. Right.
Now, Mr. going back to you and talking about the balance of power in the world today, as we talked about, there are nuclear armed states and that has shifted, but also the future of warfare. What do you see evolving? How do you see previous mechanisms that were put in place degenerating? And what do you think needs to be done?
Well, I think what needs to be done is we need to have a president who is very firm in terms of keeping our commitments. A lot of the countries in Europe now worry, would we come to their aid if Russia, as my colleagues have said here, becomes aggressive and decides, for example, to go into the Baltic countries. I think when you have a rising power like China, which is getting more nuclear weapons, could something happen if they go over these disputed islands in the South China Sea? You also have a problem which is affecting the world, which is not military, and that is global climate change. And basically, the United States has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, and this is something that's going to hurt the whole world and lead to a lot of instability and a lot of conflicts. And so, and then finally, you have with global media like we have here, you basically have what's happening in Hong Kong now. So the people there can rise up against China. How will they handle that? Similarly, we saw when India went into Kashmir, they tried to cut off all of the access to the stuff that you have on your cell phones and computers.
So, Mr. Korb, now talking about all these conflicts here and how there doesn't seem to be any repercussions, at least not any that we're witnessing now. The world seems to continuously rely on archaic mechanisms. What do you think is hindering going out and trying to rework the systems in place, the institutions in place that are supposed to bring about peace and ensure that military conflicts do not escalate?
Well, I think they really rely on the United States to take the lead, because even though we're not as powerful compared to the rest of the world as we were at the end of the Cold War, we still are the world's most powerful nation, the largest economy, the largest military. So we've got to take the lead, as we did, for example, in the problem in the Balkans in the 90s, where we led an international coalition in to deal with it, or the first Gulf War, where we had something like 25 nations contribute troops to drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait.
Right. Mr. Ozulker, as Mr. Korb said, that the world needs to look towards the United States, but it doesn't seem that the leader of the United States is in any position to actually lead the world. And if he secures another term, what does the world do? I mean, these are pressing conflicts. More and more people around the world are facing displacement. More and more people are being killed. Civilian infrastructure is being targeted. With all this that is happening, who needs to rise to the occasion? Who should be in the power to actually lead the world and move towards solutions?
Well, first of all, the United States need to change their policy. And unless Mr. Trump is no more elected and the new policy in the United States comes back, I don't think that the world will be in peace. The first part. And secondly, in Russia or in other places where democracy is unfortunately is very weak, the war is. I mean, when these leaders say I make war, they do it. There is nothing to stop them from not doing it. So more freedom, more democracy, and a new world order is very much needed. And I think that, first of all, the leading nations of the world need to change their minds and their policies and help also the others to establish the balance of power, but as much everybody has its own rights. And it is when we speak of interests in the world, as Mr. Trump puts it forward, he says in different speeches, there are interests of the United Nations and the others. We must change, first of all, this approach and this mentality, and secondly, spread this change to all other nations in the world. Right. Otherwise, it's not possible to prevent the upgrading of this war risk in the world.
Right. Mr. Bordonaro, talking about balance of power, there's a clear imbalance that exists. There are nations that still run at the global policy level. They're the ones determining. We have the United Nations Security Council, permanent 5 members making decisions on behalf of the entire world. Now, the deadlock still exists. I mean, we still haven't found a solution as to how to solve that, how to create a more democratic process in which more and more countries are involved. Now, what are the threats to that in the future if this continues to persist and we don't find solutions?
Well, you said the right word. You said deadlock, and actually is what we are seeing. So the legalistic system that we tried to organize after World War II, based on laws, based on American standards, and before that it was also about the golden standard, has failed. But nowadays, after the Cold War and a very small period of time when we experienced the world, we are facing more and more a multipolar and multi-level governance, and it's just economic means and political will of many countries are growing and getting stronger. So it's going to be a different world where we're going to negotiate again, but the legalistic system that we tried to establish in the 50s has failed.
Right.
It's going to be now more about consensus.
Right. Mr. Korb, just before we end the show, I do want to touch on another important point, which is technology and how we're seeing it as at the forefront of everything that's happening. Information, the data that's being collected. How much of a threat is that to world stability and peace? And what do you see happening in the future in regards to that?
Well, there's no doubt about the fact that one cannot cover up incidents like they used to. So if there's trouble in Kashmir, if there's trouble in Hong Kong, the world knows about it. And basically that gets people to act differently. I think the people in Hong Kong know that the rest of the world is watching them. That's why they're willing to do this. Now, that could lead to instability.
But also artificial intelligence and technology in that regard, information, our data being collected. We don't just see global governments anymore. We see global corporations that have all our information, who use that marketing revenue to influence politics, to influence policies. How do you think that's going to play in the future?
Well, I think you're going to see continuing use. As we found out, the Russians interfered in our election in 2016. The only question is, did Trump cooperate with them? But they did have an influence on the election. And a new form of warfare is called cyber warfare. We've just seen a cyber attack on a Iranian site for launching weapons, launching satellites into space. So yes, this is the new form. We call it artificial intelligence. And the United States has a new contract called the JEDI basically to get our capabilities there.
Right. On that point, thank you much, Mr. Lawrence Korb, for joining us and talking to us. Thank you, Mr. Valerio Bordonaro, and thank you so much, Mr. Uluc Ozulker, for joining us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye.